Welcome to a deep dive into everyday English expressions. We're going to be using this English learning podcast that you shared with me to kind of look at some of the origins and meanings behind these common phrases that we use all the time. Ever wonder, where "speak of the devil" comes from, or what it really means to get your ducks in a row?
Yeah.
Well, we're about to find out.
I think one of the things that's really interesting about these expressions is they kind of tap into human psychology and cultural values. So we're going to uncover some cool connections between the phrases you use every day and the way that we as humans just kind of think and act and interact with each other.
I like it, yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
let's jump right in with one that is about action, I guess you could say. Get it out of your system.
Okay.
The podcast uses the example of somebody finally going skydiving after wanting to do it for years, and they're finally just do it, and it's like such a rush.
Yeah, that's a great example because it really does highlight this human need for closure.
Right.
You know, we often feel compelled to take action, even if it's something that scares us a little bit or that we're nervous about, just to have that sense of completion. It's like we're trying to tie up loose ends, whether it's like a physical challenge like skydiving or an emotional issue that's kind of been lingering in the back of your mind.
So true, yeah. I can definitely relate to that, just doing the thing so I can close the loop on it.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of moving on, you highlighted this one, give someone the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that that is very relevant to your situation at work right now.
It is.
So give someone the benefit of the doubt is really about navigating trust, especially when there's a risk involved.
Yeah.
You have to balance your own skepticism with a willingness to believe someone's explanation, even if we don't have all the facts.
Right.
The example they use in the podcast is a coworker showing up late for work and whether or not you're going to believe their excuse.
Yeah.
But like you said, that's really hard to do in a work environment, especially when people are being held accountable for their actions. Do you think that it suggests anything about power dynamics?
Yeah, I think it does because I think in order to give someone the benefit of the doubt, the person giving it has to be in a position of authority.
Right.
They have to be able to accept an explanation and not impose consequences, or they have to be able to impose consequences.
Right.
So it's a really interesting look at how trust and power dynamics can really intersect, especially at work.
Totally. And like you were saying, it's not just about taking someone at their word.
Right.
It depends on your experience with that person or other people and just societal norms and everything's at play.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Ready for this one? No pain, no gain.
Yeah.
This one's really motivating and kind of a little scary.
Yeah. No pain, no gain.
Yeah.
Such a classic. It's all about working hard and persevering. Anytime you want to achieve something worthwhile, it often requires effort, discipline, and sometimes just a little bit of discomfort.
They talk about it with fitness, but you can really apply it to learning English
Totally.
or building a business. Anything that you want to achieve.
Yeah. Or any skill that you want to learn and improve on. It's like a good reminder that growth often happens outside your comfort zone.
It does.
Okay, speaking of pushing yourself,
Yeah.
I'm curious about this one. Hang in there.
Okay.
The podcast highlights it as a phrase of encouragement,
Mm-hmm.
but I also kind of feel like it can be overused or a little dismissive.
I think it really depends on the context.
Yeah.
Because I can see how it could be. But if you're saying it and you really mean it and you know you're being empathetic, it can be very powerful.
Totally.
But yeah, if you're saying it and you're just being flippant about it, it's going to sound really dismissive.
Totally. Yeah, the intention behind the word. I think so too.
Yeah.
Okay, let's switch gears to some that are about thinking and communicating.
Okay.
This one always makes me smile. A penny for your thoughts.
Yeah.
It's just a nice way to ask somebody what they're thinking.
It's very charming. I also think it's interesting because it reflects how we value thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Because the phrase is thought to have originated in the 16th century, and back then a penny was worth a lot more.
Right.
So it's interesting to think about, do we still value our thoughts that much today?
It's such a good question because we're bombarded with everybody else's thoughts and opinions these days.
Yeah.
It's hard to even hear our own.
Right. It's very noisy.
Yeah.
So I wonder if a penny for your thoughts really has the same weight that it did back then.
That's such a good point. Okay, this one always makes me breathe a sigh of relief.
Okay.
It's not rocket science.
I know. I love that one, too. I think it's interesting because it shows how we like to categorize things by how complex they are. But what's rocket science to one person might be super easy to another. So it just reminds us that everything is relative. What might seem daunting at first can be really easy once you get the hang of it.
I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
I mean, when I first started learning English, it was like rocket science. But, with persistence and the right instruction,
Yeah.
it got a lot easier.
Yeah.
Okay, speaking of challenges, let's talk about letting someone off the hook. You mentioned this specifically in relation to a recent situation with a
Oh,
colleague.
yeah, I did.
Letting someone off the hook implies a release from like accountability or consequences.
Uh-huh.
So it's kind of fascinating that that one phrase really sums up this really complex social dynamic.
It does.
Like it's about forgiveness or grace or
Yeah.
even withholding it.
Right.
It's like the justice system in a nutshell.
It is.
Right. We weigh the offense and the context and the relationship, and then we decide whether we want to hold somebody accountable or not.
Mm-hmm.
And as you've been experiencing, that can have ripple effects throughout a workplace.
Definitely. Definitely.
Okay. Get ready for this one, rapid fire.
Okay.
The source material kind of throws out a few colorful idioms. You had them marked in your notes, so I want to get your take on why they're so memorable.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, once in a blue moon.
Once in a blue moon, I think it just evokes rarity and wonder.
Yeah.
It's that blue moon.
So visual.
Something that doesn't happen very often.
Okay, how about at the drop of a hat?
Okay, at the drop of a hat is just so spontaneous. It's
Yeah.
very immediate. It feels like you're just dropping a hat and something happens right away.
It's like a sudden burst of action.
Yeah.
Okay, last one, to hit the sack.
To hit the sack, I think it's funny. It's like you're hitting a punching bag, but you're really just going to bed.
Yeah. It's just a silly way to say something so ordinary.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to something I think that is pretty important for you in your own professional development.
Okay.
Expressing opinions professionally.
That's important.
You got to do it in the right way.
You do. I think one thing that they emphasized in the source material was not using the same phrase over and over again.
Right.
So instead of saying, I think all the time, you can say, from my perspective or in my view.
Yeah.
It just makes you sound more sophisticated. And then they also talked about how powerful neither do I can be if you're agreeing with a negative statement.
It's like that little verbal high five.
It is.
Totally. Okay, speaking of subtle tools, let's talk about transitions. You mentioned that you wanted to dig into these a little bit more, and with good reason. These little words have such a big impact on the way that our communication flows and how clearly we communicate.
They're very powerful. Yeah, and in the source material, they actually have a list of over 50 of them, and they break them down by their function.
Oh, wow.
Which I think makes it a lot easier to learn them. It shows you how you can take very simple ideas and expand on them, so it makes you sound more fluent and confident.
So it's like a secret weapon for anybody who wants to communicate better. Are there any that stand out to you as particularly helpful or that you like?
Yeah, I really liked the ones that contrast and contradict.
Oh,
Like, however, and on the other hand.
right.
Because I feel like it makes for a more sophisticated, nuanced argument, and it challenges assumptions, and it presents a more balanced perspective.
Absolutely. And those are so important in professional communication.
They are.
You know, being able to present a dissenting opinion in a way that isn't confrontational.
Yeah, it's just more thoughtful, and it can create a more constructive dialogue.
Yeah, you're building a bridge.
Exactly. And that's really valuable
That's awesome.
in every area of life, not just work.
So true. All right, well, this has been really great. We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to me how these small tweaks in our language can have such a big impact on how we're perceived
Yeah.
and how we can communicate our ideas clearly. It's like we're uncovering all these secret codes and meanings within everyday language.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Okay.
And speaking of codes, I noticed you highlighted a section in the source material about greetings in North America.
Oh, yeah.
What's up with that?
Yeah, so that's interesting because it shows how even greetings can have cultural nuances. For example, you wouldn't say goodnight to greet someone in North America unless you're about to go to bed.
Really?
You'd say good evening.
Interesting.
So I can see how that might trip up someone who's learning English. You know, they might not realize those subtle differences.
Totally. It's a good reminder that language isn't just about grammar and vocab. It's really about understanding the culture that it's spoken in.
It is. It is.
So they also talk about the subtle differences between just saying hello and hi there in North America.
Yeah, they did.
Okay, so hello is more formal and hi there is more casual.
Yeah, more friendly.
Wow. So even within greetings, there's like this unspoken etiquette, I guess you could say.
There is.
Okay, speaking of etiquette, let's talk about expressing gratitude.
Jack.
What are some common ways to say thank you in North America that go beyond just a simple thank you?
Well, they said that you can say thank you very much or thank you so much.
Okay.
And that makes it sound more sincere.
Mm-hmm.
And then informally, people might say thanks or cheers. So it depends on the situation.
Right, right. I guess you wouldn't say cheers to your boss if they gave you a promotion.
Probably not.
Right. Maybe to a friend who bought you coffee.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, what about asking for something politely?
Okay.
What are some ways that tourists visiting North America could do that?
Well, one thing you can always do is start with please.
Oh,
So
lovely.
instead of saying, can I have the bill, you could say, please, can I have the bill?
Right. It does make a big difference.
It does.
Well, just that little word. And they talk about using more indirect language.
They do.
Right.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, I want a glass of water,
Yeah,
you would say, could I get a glass of water, please?
right. Or would it be possible
Oh, right. Would it be possible?
to get a glass of water?
Yeah, it's more of a suggestion than a demand.
It is. It is.
Yeah. So North American communication is about being polite and indirect,
Right.
especially in those kind of formal settings.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's get to the one that I think a lot of English learners struggle with.
Okay.
Make versus do.
Yeah,
These two little verbs seem so simple,
they do.
but they're not.
Not at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we use them in so many different ways.
Right.
So the podcast gives this general rule of thumb.
Yeah.
Make usually involves like creating or producing something,
Mhm.
and do usually refers to actions or work or activities.
Right.
But of course there are exceptions.
Of course there are.
Right.
Yeah.
We make a decision,
Right.
but that's an action.
It is.
And we do our homework,
Yeah.
but that's something that we create.
Yeah.
So how are we supposed to know?
I think it comes down to collocations, which are words that commonly go together.
Okay.
So, for example, we make plans, we make promises, we make mistakes, we do business, we do favors, we do our best.
Right.
So it's just those common pairings.
So we're not just remembering a rule, we're remembering all these different combinations.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the podcast also gets into some really fascinating idioms using make and do.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Like make do
Right.
and make a go of it.
Right. Exactly.
And I love that because it's all about being resourceful and determined and figuring things out even when things aren't perfect.
Right. You don't always have the perfect circumstances. You just have to make do.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's a good life lesson, I think, in general.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, now let's talk about asking questions.
Okay.
Because the podcast seems to really emphasize asking clear and concise questions to get the information that you need.
It does. It does.
I mean, that just seems like common sense.
Yeah.
But why do they make a whole thing about it?
Well, I think it's more nuanced than it might seem.
Okay.
Because it's not just about stringing words together in a question.
Right.
It's about framing your inquiry in a way that elicits a very specific type of information that you're seeking.
Oh, I see. So it's about strategy.
It is.
Yeah. Not just being vague and hoping for the best.
Right.
Okay.
So they talk about word order and using the right question words and avoiding ambiguity.
Okay, so you're being intentional with your questions.
Yeah, you are.
I got it. And then they also talk about closed-ended questions versus open-ended.
They do.
So closed-ended can just be answered with a yes or no,
Uh-huh.
whereas open-ended is like, tell me more.
Exactly.
Okay, and they actually give some examples of how to use these different types of questions.
They do. They do.
Okay, so closed-ended would be like, are you hungry?
Right.
And open-ended would be like, what are you most looking forward to today?
Exactly.
Oh, okay, so it's about being a good conversationalist
It is. It is.
and asking the right questions.
Right.
And they actually even give some specific questions starters.
They do.
Oh, wow. So, like, why do you think that is? Or how did you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, those are good.
Yeah.
I like those.
Yeah.
Okay, now let's talk about giving directions.
Okay.
This is something that they say is so important to be very clear and concise about.
It is.
Whether you're telling somebody how to get to a restaurant or how to put together a piece of furniture,
Right.
you've got to give clear directions.
You do.
And the key is landmarks.
Yes. Specific landmarks, distances, and turns.
Right. So instead of
is-
saying go down the road a bit, you'd say walk 2 blocks north and turn left at the traffic lights.
Exactly.
That's so much better.
much clearer.
Yeah. And I imagine it's even harder when you're doing it over the phone or through text
Right.
because you don't have those visuals.
Exactly.
So what are some ways that you could make it easier?
Well, I think you can use compass directions
Oh, right. North, south, east, west.
and estimate travel time.
Okay.
So instead of saying, oh, it's a short drive, you'd say it's about a 10-minute drive from here.
Yeah. Okay. So that gives the other person a better idea of what to expect.
It does.
It's like you're painting a verbal map.
Yeah, you are.
I love that. Okay. Now let's move on to something that I think can be kind of awkward.
Okay.
Making small talk.
Yeah,
I know it's important,
it is.
but it can be a little awkward. So how does the podcast say we should handle that?
Well, they say that small talk is an important part of social etiquette, especially in North America.
Right.
And it's a way to break the ice and build a rapport.
It's like you're kind of like testing the waters
Yeah, you are.
with the other person to see if there's a connection.
Yeah.
Okay, so what are some of those safe topics?
Well, you can always talk about the weather.
Oh, yeah, weather's good.
Yeah, current events or sports or hobbies.
Okay, or like if you're at a party,
Mm-hmm.
the food or the music,
Right, something neutral, relatable.
just to get the conversation started.
Yeah.
But what if it's somebody you don't know very well?
Uh-huh.
How do you keep that conversation going?
Well, I think you ask open-ended questions.
Okay,
So instead of saying, do you like movies, which can be answered with a yes or no,
right.
you say, what kind of movies do you like?
Oh, right.
Or what was the last movie that you saw that you really loved?
Oh, those are good. I like those a lot. Okay, now let's talk about compliments.
Okay.
It can be kind of hard to give compliments in a way that doesn't sound cheesy or awkward.
Yeah, it can.
Or just like not sincere.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So what does the podcast say is the best way to do that?
Be genuine and specific.
Okay.
So instead of saying, you look nice,
Right.
you can say, I love that color on you. It brings out your eyes.
Oh.
Or that's a great haircut. It suits you.
Oh, I see. So you're going beyond just the generic.
Yeah, you are.
You're adding those personal touches.
Exactly.
And in North America, compliments are given and received in a casual, lighthearted way.
They are.
You don't have to be super serious about it.
Yeah,
And it's okay to use humor.
it is.
Oh, how do we respond when we receive a compliment?
A simple thank you is always good.
Yeah.
Or you could say, I appreciate that, or that's kind of you to say.
Okay.
And then if you feel comfortable, you can return the compliment.
Right. Like, I love your shoes.
You're right, exactly. Right. Nice little back and forth.
Yeah.
And it keeps the conversation flowing. Okay, now let's move on to something that I think can be tricky in any language.
Okay.
Expressing agreement and disagreement.
Yeah.
Especially when you're trying to navigate all these different opinions and perspectives.
Right. You want to be able to share your view without being offensive.
Right, you want to stand your ground,
Yeah.
but you want to do it diplomatically.
Yeah.
So what are some good ways to just express agreement?
Well, you could say, I agree. I think so too.
Yeah.
That's a good point. You're right.
Right,
I see your point. I understand where you're coming from.
those are good. And what about disagreeing?
For disagreeing, I think one thing that's really helpful is to acknowledge their perspective before you share yours.
Right.
So you could say, I understand where you're coming from, but I see it a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Or, I respect your opinion, but I have to disagree.
Yeah, those are good. And then they also talk about using I statements.
They do. They do. So instead of saying you're wrong, you'd say, I disagree with that.
Right.
I have a different perspective.
Right, exactly.
So it's not like me versus you. It's like us versus the problem.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. That's really good. Now let's talk about introductions,
Okay.
because first impressions are so important.
They are.
And I think that they can make or break an interaction.
Yeah, again, they can.
So what are some key things to remember when introducing yourself in English?
Well, it sounds very basic,
Okay.
but make eye contact, smile, speak clearly,
Mhm.
and then you say your name.
Right.
And depending on the situation, maybe your occupation or your connection to whatever event you're at.
Okay. So basic but important.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about introducing other people?
For introducing other people, you should mention their name and something about them that is relevant.
Okay.
So you could say, this is Sarah, she's a colleague of mine. Or this is John, he's an expert in marketing.
I see. So it's creating a little bit of context.
It is.
Yeah. And you should also pay attention to those cultural differences.
Yeah.
Right. Some cultures, you bow, some you shake hands.
Right.
So it's all about being aware of those nuances so you don't accidentally offend anybody.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk about making requests and offering help.
Okay.
This is where politeness and consideration really come into play.
It does.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's about finding that balance between being direct and being mindful of the other person's feelings.
Right.
So what are some common phrases for making requests in English?
Well, again, starting with please is always good.
Okay.
So you could say, please, could you pass the salt? Or please, could you help me with this?
Yeah, okay. And then for offering help.
You can say, can I help you with that? Or would you like me to? And
Right.
whatever it is.
Right.
Right.
I see. Okay. So I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in how people make requests or offer help?
There are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me.
Well, in some cultures, it's considered rude to directly ask for something.
Oh, wow. Really?
Whereas in others, it's perfectly fine.
Interesting.
And then in some cultures, offering help might be considered intrusive,
Right.
but in others, it's a sign of kindness.
Wow, that's so interesting.
So again, just being aware of those nuances is very helpful.
Yeah, so interesting. All right, well, I think we need to take a little break. We've covered so much.
We have.
It's amazing to me how much depth there is to everyday language
Yeah.
and how these small tweaks in the way that we speak can have such a big impact on how we're perceived
Mm-hmm.
and how effectively we can communicate. It's like we're uncovering all these secret codes and hidden meanings
Exactly.
within language.
Yeah.
So when we come back, we'll continue to explore some more of these fascinating nuances of communication.
Sounds good. Yeah, it really is fascinating how, like, even the smallest tweaks in our language can have such a big impact on how we're perceived and how effectively we can get our ideas across.
Yeah, it's like we're uncovering all these secret codes and hidden meanings within everyday language. And speaking of codes, I noticed you highlighted this section in the source material about greetings in North America.
Oh, yeah.
What's up with that?
Yeah, so that's interesting because it shows how even greetings can have these cultural nuances that we might not be aware of.
Okay.
For instance, the podcast points out that in North America, you wouldn't typically say good night as a greeting unless you're actually about to go to bed.
Really?
It's more common to use good evening in those situations.
Oh, interesting. I can see how that could easily trip up somebody who's learning English. They might not realize that.
Right.
It's a good reminder that language isn't just about grammar and vocabulary. It's about understanding the cultural context, too.
Exactly. And the podcast also highlights these subtle differences between saying hello and hi there in North America.
Oh, okay.
Hello is generally seen as more formal, while hi there's more casual and friendly. So it's interesting how even those seemingly interchangeable greetings can convey slightly different levels of formality depending on the situation.
It's like there's this whole unspoken etiquette around greetings.
Right.
Okay. Speaking of etiquette, let's talk about expressing gratitude.
Okay.
What are some common ways to say thank you in North America that go beyond just the basic phrase?
Well, the podcast points out that simply adding very much or so much to thank you can make it sound more sincere and heartfelt.
Okay.
And in informal settings, people might say thanks or cheers to express gratitude.
Okay.
It's all about choosing the right level of formality for the situation.
Right. Like you probably wouldn't say cheers to your boss after they gave you a promotion.
Right.
But it would be perfectly appropriate to say to a friend who buys you a coffee.
Exactly.
Now, what about those times when you need to ask for something politely? What phrases does the podcast suggest for tourists visiting North America?
Well, one of the simplest and most effective ways to soften a request is to start with please. For instance, instead of just saying, can I have the bill?
Right.
You could say, please, could I have the bill?
Okay.
It just sounds much more polite and considerate.
That makes a lot of sense. It's a small change,
Yeah.
but it makes a big difference in how your request is perceived.
Exactly. And the podcast also highlights the importance of using indirect language when making requests in North America.
Okay.
So instead of directly saying, I want a glass of water,
Right.
you might say, could I get a glass of water, please? Or would it be possible to get a glass of water?
Oh, right. Would it be possible?
Yeah.
So it's like you're making it more of a suggestion than a demand.
Right.
That definitely seems to be a common thread in North American communication, valuing politeness and indirectness, especially in formal settings.
Absolutely. It's all about striking that balance between assertiveness and consideration for others. Now, let's move on to a topic that often causes confusion for English learners, the difference between make and do.
Oh, yeah.
These two seemingly simple verbs can be tricky to master because they're used in so many different ways.
I remember struggling with this myself when I was first learning English.
Right.
The podcast provides this helpful rule of thumb. Make generally involves creating or producing something, while do usually refers to actions or activities. But I'm curious, are there any exceptions to that rule?
There are always exceptions in language.
Right.
For instance, we say make a decision even though deciding is an action.
Okay.
And we say do your homework even though homework is something that you create.
So how do you know which verb to use in those cases?
It often comes down to collocations,
Okay.
which are words that commonly go together.
Right.
So for instance, we typically make plans, promises, and mistakes while we do business favors and our best.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
So it's not just about remembering a single rule, but also about paying attention to those common word pairings.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the podcast also dives into some fascinating make and do idioms like make do and make a go of it.
Oh, right?
These expressions capture a sense of resourcefulness and determination, highlighting how we often have to improvise or adapt to challenging situations.
That's so true. It's like a reminder that we don't always need everything to be perfect in order to achieve our goals.
Right.
Sometimes we just have to make do with what we have and find creative solutions.
Exactly. It's a testament to human resilience and adaptability. Now let's shift gears and talk about asking questions.
Okay.
The source material emphasizes the importance of asking clear and concise questions in order to obtain the information you need.
That seems like a pretty basic communication skill.
Yeah.
Why do you think the podcast dedicates a whole section to it?
Well, asking questions effectively is more nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
Okay.
It's not just about stringing words together in the form of a question. It's about framing your inquiry in a way that elicits the specific information you're seeking.
Ah, I see. So it's about being intentional and strategic with your questions, not just asking something vague and hoping for the best.
Exactly. And the podcast also highlights the difference between open-ended and closed-ended questions.
Okay.
Closed-ended questions like, are you hungry, can only be answered with a yes or no. While open-ended questions like, what are you most looking forward to today, invite more detailed and thoughtful responses.
That's a really helpful distinction. It makes me realize how much thought goes into crafting questions that will spark meaningful conversations.
It's like you're setting the stage for a deeper level of engagement. And the podcast even provides some specific question starters that can be particularly helpful for sparking insightful conversations, like, why do you think that is? Or how did you come to that conclusion?
Oh, those are good. I'm definitely going to try those out. Now let's talk about giving directions.
Okay.
The podcast stresses how crucial it is to be clear and concise when guiding someone to a specific location, whether you're explaining how to get to a restaurant or how to assemble a piece of furniture.
It's true. Giving directions effectively is all about providing specific landmarks, distances, and turns.
Right. Yeah.
Instead of just saying, go down the road a bit,
Yeah.
you might say, walk 2 blocks north and turn left at the traffic lights.
That makes perfect sense. It's about painting a clear mental picture for the other person so they can visualize the route. And I imagine it's even more challenging when you're giving directions over the phone or through text where you can't rely on visual cues.
You're right. In those cases, it's helpful to use compass directions like north, south, east, and west.
Okay.
And providing estimated travel times can also be really helpful.
Okay.
Instead of just saying it's a short drive, you might say it's about a 10-minute drive from here.
That gives the other person a much better sense of what to expect.
Yeah.
It's like you're creating a verbal map for them to follow.
Yeah.
Now let's move on to a topic that can sometimes feel a bit daunting, especially in new situations making small talk.
Yeah.
The podcast highlights how small talk is an important part of social etiquette, especially in North America. It can help to break the ice and build rapport.
It's true. Small talk often gets a bad rap, but it serves a valuable purpose.
Okay.
It's a way of signaling that you're open to interaction and that you're interested in getting to know the other person.
It's like a social dance. You're testing the waters, trying to find a rhythm and connection with the other person.
Exactly.
What are some common topics that people tend to talk about when making small talk in North America?
The weather is always a safe bet.
Oh yeah, the weather always works.
You can also talk about current events, sports, or hobbies.
Okay.
And if you're at a social gathering, you might comment on the food or the music.
Okay.
The key is to find something neutral and relatable to start the conversation.
Right. It's about finding that common ground, that shared experience that can spark a connection. But what about when you're making small talk with someone you don't know very well? How do you keep the conversation flowing without it feeling forced?
Asking open-ended questions is a great way to encourage the other person to talk about themselves and their interests.
Oh, okay.
Instead of asking, do you like movies, which can be answered with a simple yes or no,
Right.
you might ask, what kind of movies do you enjoy?
Okay.
Or what's the last movie you saw that you really loved?
Those are great examples. It's like you're inviting the other person to share a part of themselves, which can create a sense of intimacy and connection, even in a casual conversation.
Exactly. It's about showing genuine interest in the other person, which is the foundation of any meaningful interaction.
Now let's talk about something that can be a bit tricky to navigate in any language, giving and receiving compliments.
Yeah.
The podcast highlights how compliments are a powerful way to express appreciation and build positive relationships.
They really are. A sincere compliment can brighten someone's day and make them feel valued.
It's like you're giving someone a little gift, a verbal bouquet of appreciation.
Yeah.
But I know I sometimes struggle with finding the right words to express a compliment without it sounding awkward or insincere.
The key is to be genuine and specific.
Okay.
So instead of just saying, you look nice,
Right.
you might say, I love that color on you. It really brings out your eyes. Or, that's a great haircut. It really suits you.
Oh, I see. So it's about going beyond the generic and adding a personal touch.
Exactly. And the podcast also points out that in North America, compliments are often given and received in a casual and lighthearted way.
Okay.
Don't be afraid to use humor or playful language when appropriate.
That makes sense. It's like you're creating a more relaxed and friendly atmosphere. Now, what about when you're on the receiving end of a compliment? What are some appropriate ways to respond?
A simple thank you is always a good response.
Yeah.
You can also add a brief comment like, I appreciate that, or that's kind of you to say.
Okay.
And if you feel comfortable, you can even return the compliment.
It's like a little dance of appreciation.
Right.
You're acknowledging the compliment and expressing gratitude while also keeping the conversation flowing. Now let's move on to a topic that's essential for any kind of meaningful communication, expressing agreement and disagreement.
Yeah, that can get tricky.
It can, especially when we're trying to navigate different perspectives and opinions.
Right.
The podcast emphasizes the importance of expressing our views clearly and respectfully, whether we're agreeing or disagreeing with someone. Right. It's like finding that balance between assertiveness and diplomacy. You want to be able to stand your ground while also maintaining a harmonious relationship with the other person.
Right.
What are some common phrases that people use to express agreement in English?
Some simple and effective phrases for expressing agreement include, I agree. I think so too. That's a good point. Or you're right.
Okay.
You can also use phrases like, I see your point, or I understand where you're coming from, to acknowledge the other person's perspective before expressing your own.
Those are all great. And what about when you disagree with someone? Are there any strategies for expressing your dissent in a respectful manner?
One helpful strategy is to start by acknowledging the other person's perspective before presenting your own.
Okay.
You might say something like, I understand where you're coming from, but I see it a little differently.
Okay.
Or, I respect your opinion, but I have to disagree.
Those are great examples. It's like you're building a bridge of understanding even when you have differing viewpoints.
Exactly. And the podcast also highlights the importance of using I statements when expressing disagreement.
Okay.
Instead of saying you're wrong, you might say, I disagree with that, or I have a different perspective on this.
Okay.
It helps to keep the conversation focused on the ideas rather than on personal attacks.
That's a really valuable tip. It's like you're shifting the focus from me versus you to us versus the problem.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something that's essential for creating connections and building relationships, introducing yourself and others.
Oh yeah, first impressions are so important.
They are. The podcast emphasizes the importance of making a good first impression when introducing yourself in English, especially in formal or professional settings.
It's true. A warm and confident introduction can set the tone for a positive interaction.
Yeah.
What are some key things to keep in mind when introducing yourself in English?
When introducing yourself, it's important to make eye contact, smile, and speak clearly.
Okay.
You should state your name, and depending on the context, you might also mention your occupation or your connection to the event or group.
Those are great tips.
Mm-hmm.
And what about when you're introducing someone else? Are there any specific conventions to follow?
When introducing someone else, it's important to mention their name and something about them that is relevant to the situation.
Okay.
For example, you might say, this is Sarah, she's a colleague of mine, or this is John, he's an expert in marketing.
Those are helpful examples. It's amazing how a few well-chosen words can create a sense of connection and facilitate introductions.
It's true. And the podcast also highlights the importance of paying attention to cultural differences when making introductions.
Right, because those are so important.
They are.
In some cultures, it's customary to bow or shake hands, while in other cultures, a simple nod of the head is sufficient.
Right.
It's always helpful to be aware of these nuances to avoid any unintentional faux pas.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about something that's essential for fostering positive relationships, making requests and offering help.
Yeah, okay.
This is where the art of polite and considerate communication really comes into play. The podcast emphasizes the importance of using phrases that convey respect and consideration when making requests or offering assistance.
Right. It's about finding that balance between being direct and being mindful of the other person's feelings. What are some common phrases that people use to make requests in English?
When making a request, it's always helpful to start with please.
Okay.
You might say something like, please could you pass me the salt, or please could you help me with this?
Those are great examples. And what about when you want to offer help to someone? Are there any specific phrases that are commonly used?
You can offer help by saying something like, can I help you with that? Or would you like me to? And then whatever it is that you're offering to do.
Those are all great ways to offer assistance. It's amazing how a few simple words can create a sense of support and camaraderie. Now, I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in the way people make requests or offer help that you've observed?
Definite. In some cultures, it's considered rude to directly ask for something, while in other cultures, it's seen as perfectly normal.
Wow.
And in some cultures, offering help might be seen as an intrusion, while in other cultures, it's seen as a gesture of kindness.
Really?
So it's always helpful to be aware of these cultural nuances to avoid any unintentional misunderstandings.
That's a great reminder. It's all part of the complex and fascinating tapestry of human communication and cultural diversity. Now let's dive into a topic that's particularly relevant to your professional life, participating in meetings.
Ah, yes, meetings.
They're an integral part of most workplaces.
They are.
And being able to communicate effectively in those settings is crucial for success.
It is. The podcast stresses the importance of active listening, clear and concise speaking, and respect for others' opinions.
It's like you're playing a role in a collaborative performance, and
Yeah.
everyone needs to be in sync to achieve the desired outcome.
Exactly. And the podcast provides some helpful phrases for participating effectively in meetings like, I have an idea, or I'd like to add to that for contributing your thoughts.
Okay.
And I have a question, or could you clarify for seeking clarification?
Those are all great phrases to have in your meeting vocabulary. They allow you to contribute meaningfully without interrupting or derailing the conversation.
Precisely. And the podcast also highlights the importance of paying attention to nonverbal cues in meetings.
Right.
Making eye contact, nodding your head, and maintaining an open and engaged posture can all convey respect and interest.
It's like you're saying, I'm present, I'm listening, and I value what you have to say without even uttering a word.
Exactly. And those nonverbal cues can be just as important as your spoken words in conveying your professionalism and engagement.
Now let's shift gears and talk about something that's often overlooked in communication, but that can be incredibly powerful, sharing personal stories and experiences.
Stories have a way of connecting us on a deeper level.
They do.
They allow us to share our vulnerabilities, our triumphs, and our lessons learned, creating a sense of empathy and understanding.
It's like we're inviting others into our inner world, creating a bridge of shared experience that transcends cultural differences and language barriers. What are some key things to keep in mind when sharing personal stories in English?
The podcast emphasizes the importance of choosing stories that are relevant to the conversation
Okay.
and to keep them concise and engaging.
Okay.
You should also be mindful of your audience and avoid sharing anything that might be considered too personal or inappropriate.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like you're curating your stories to fit the context and the audience, creating a space where your experiences can resonate with others.
Exactly. And the podcast also highlights the importance of using vivid language and sensory details to bring your stories to life.
Okay.
Instead of just saying, I was happy, you might say, my heart soared with joy, or a wave of warmth washed over me.
Those are beautiful examples. It's like you're painting a picture with words, allowing your listeners to step into your shoes and experience the world through your eyes.
Precisely. And that's the power of storytelling. It allows us to connect with others on a deeper level and build bridges of understanding and empathy.
Now let's talk about something that's essential for human connection, expressing emotions.
Okay.
The podcast emphasizes the importance of being able to express our feelings in a clear and appropriate manner, both for our own well-being and for building healthy relationships.
It's true. Bottling up our emotions can be detrimental to our mental and physical health.
Right.
And it can create barriers in our relationships. Being able to express our feelings authentically, whether it's joy, sadness, anger, or fear, is crucial for living a fulfilling and connected life.
It's like we're giving ourselves permission to be fully human, embracing the full spectrum of emotions that make us who we are.
Exactly. And the podcast provides some helpful phrases for expressing different emotions in English.
Okay.
For instance, you can say, I'm over the moon to express extreme happiness,
Okay.
or I'm feeling blue to express sadness.
Those are great examples. They add a touch of color and imagery to our language, making it easier to convey the nuances of our emotions.
And don't be afraid to use metaphors or similes to describe your feelings. You might say, my heart feels heavy, or I feel like I'm walking on sunshine.
Those are beautiful. It's like you're giving your listeners a glimpse into your inner world, allowing them to connect with you on a more emotional level. Now, I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in the way people express emotions that you've observed?
Definitely. In some cultures, it's considered taboo to openly express anger or sadness, while in other cultures, it's seen as perfectly normal and healthy.
Wow.
And the way we express affection can also vary widely.
Right.
In some cultures, physical touch is common, while in other cultures, it might be seen as inappropriate. It's always helpful to be aware of these cultural nuances to avoid any unintentional faux pas.
That's a great reminder. It's all part of the complex and fascinating tapestry of human communication and cultural diversity. Now let's talk about something that's essential for resolving conflicts and maintaining harmonious relationships: apologizing and forgiving.
Yes. These are two of the most powerful tools we have for healing rifts and restoring balance in our relationships.
Yeah.
The podcast highlights the importance of offering sincere apologies when we've made a mistake and of extending forgiveness when we've been wronged.
It's like we're acknowledging our own imperfections and extending grace to both ourselves and others.
Exactly. And the podcast provides some helpful phrases for apologizing effectively in English.
Okay.
You can say, "I'm truly sorry for," or "please forgive me for," followed by a brief explanation of what you did wrong.
Those are great examples. And what about when you're on the receiving end of an apology? Are there any specific phrases that are commonly used to convey forgiveness?
You can say, "It's okay, I forgive you, don't worry about it," or "no harm done."
Those are all gracious responses that can help to mend fences and restore harmony. It's amazing how a few simple words can have such a powerful impact on our relationships. Now let's dive into a topic that's essential for personal growth and development: giving and receiving feedback.
Feedback is essential for learning and improvement.
It is.
Whether we're talking about our work, our relationships, or our personal growth, constructive feedback can help us to see ourselves more clearly and to identify areas where we can grow and evolve.
It's like we're receiving a mirror that reflects back to us our strengths and areas for growth, helping us to become more self-aware and to refine our skills. What are some key things to keep in mind when giving feedback?
The podcast emphasizes the importance of being specific, objective, and respectful when giving feedback.
Okay.
Focus on the behavior or the work, not the person,
Okay.
and offer suggestions for improvement rather than just pointing out flaws.
Those are all excellent tips for giving feedback in a way that is constructive and supportive. And what about when we're on the receiving end of feedback? Are there any strategies for accepting it gracefully, even if it's not positive?
It's important to listen attentively, to ask clarifying questions, and to thank the person for their feedback.
Okay.
Even if you don't agree with everything they've said, try to find something valuable that you can take away from the experience.
Those are all excellent points. It's all about approaching feedback with a growth mindset and a willingness to learn. Now, I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in the way people give or receive feedback that you've observed?
Definitely. In some cultures, direct feedback is valued, while in other cultures, it might be considered rude or disrespectful.
Okay.
And in some cultures, it's important to save face, while in other cultures, honesty is prioritized. It's always helpful to be aware of these cultural nuances to avoid any unintentional misunderstandings.
That's a great reminder. It's all part of the complex and fascinating tapestry of human communication and cultural diversity. Now let's delve into a topic that's often overlooked, but that plays a significant role in communication: body language.
Yes, body language.
It's a powerful form of nonverbal communication that can convey a wealth of information, often without us even realizing it.
It can. It's like a secret language that we're all speaking, whether we're aware of it or not.
What are some common body language cues that convey confidence and engagement?
Making eye contact standing or sitting up straight and using open hand gestures can all project confidence and approachability.
Those are all great tips.
Yeah.
And what about when you want to convey interest and attentiveness? Are there any specific body language cues that you can use?
Nodding your head, leaning in slightly, and maintaining an open and relaxed posture can all signal that you're listening attentively and that you're engaged in the conversation.
Those are all subtle but powerful ways to communicate nonverbal engagement. It's amazing how much we can convey without even saying a word. Now, I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in body language that you've observed?
Definitely. In some cultures, direct eye contact is a sign of respect, while in other cultures, it might be considered rude or aggressive.
Okay.
And in some cultures, physical touch is a common way to express warmth and affection, while in other cultures, it might be considered inappropriate.
Right.
It's always helpful to be aware of these cultural nuances to avoid any unintentional misunderstandings.
That's a great reminder. Yeah. It's all part of the complex and fascinating tapestry of human communication and cultural diversity.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about something that can be both a powerful tool for connection and a potential source of misunderstanding: humor.
Ah, yes, humor.
It's a wonderful way to build rapport and create a sense of camaraderie, but it can also be tricky to navigate, especially across cultures.
It can. What's considered funny in one culture might be considered offensive or confusing in another.
It's true. What are some key things to keep in mind when using humor in communication, especially in cross-cultural settings?
The podcast highlights the importance of being aware of different types of humor,
Okay.
such as puns, sarcasm, and irony.
Okay.
It's also helpful to pay attention to cultural references and current events, as these often play a role in jokes and humorous anecdotes.
Those are great tips.
Oh.
And what about when you want to share a joke or a funny story?
Yeah.
Are there any strategies for delivering humor effectively?
Timing is everything.
Okay.
It's also important to gauge your audience and avoid sharing anything that might be considered offensive or inappropriate.
Those are all essential considerations. It's like you want to create a shared moment of laughter and connection, not offend or alienate anyone. I'm curious, are there any cultural differences in humor that you've observed?
Definitely. What's considered funny in one culture might not be funny in another. Some cultures appreciate slapstick humor, while others prefer dry wit. And some cultures have a higher tolerance for dark humor, while others might find it offensive. It's always helpful to be aware of these cultural nuances to avoid any unintentional faux pas.
That's a great reminder. It's all part of the rich tapestry of human communication and cultural diversity. Now let's talk about something that can add a lot of color and personality to our language. Idioms and slang.
Ah, yes, idioms and
They're the spice of language.
They are. They can make our conversations more vivid, expressive, and engaging.
But I know they can also be tricky to master, especially for English learners.
Absolutely. The podcast highlights the importance of being aware of the context
Okay.
and to use idioms and slang appropriately.
Right, you wouldn't want to use informal language in a formal setting.
Exactly.
It's also important to be mindful of your audience and avoid using any expressions that might be unfamiliar or confusing.
Right. And what about when you're trying to understand idioms and slang that you'd never heard before? Are there any strategies for decoding those expressions?
Context is key.
Yes, context is key. Pay attention to the surrounding words and the overall situation to try to decipher the meaning.
Okay.
And don't be afraid to ask for clarification if you're unsure.
Those are great tips. It's like being a language detective, piecing together the clues to unlock the meaning of these colorful expressions. Now, I'm curious, are there any particular idioms or slang words that you find particularly interesting or amusing?
I'm always fascinated by idioms that use vivid imagery to convey a concept.
Okay.
Like kick the bucket or spill the beans.
Right.
They paint such a memorable picture in our minds, and slang is constantly evolving.
Right.
So it's always fun to learn new expressions and see how language adapts to reflect current trends and cultural influences.
It's like language is a living, breathing entity that's constantly changing and evolving. Now let's shift our focus to a topic that's closely related to idioms and slang, understanding accents and dialects.
Yes, accents and dialects.
They're a testament to the incredible diversity of the English language.
They are. The podcast highlights how English is spoken in countless accents and dialects around the world, each with its own unique pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammatical nuances.
It's like a beautiful tapestry woven together from threads of different cultures and histories.
I love that analogy.
And it makes me realize that understanding different accents and dialects is about more than just being able to decipher the words. It's about appreciating the richness and diversity of human expression.
Exactly. And the podcast provides some helpful tips for navigating those linguistic variations.
Okay.
It emphasizes the importance of being patient, listening attentively, and being open to different ways of speaking.
Those are all great reminders. It's like approaching each encounter with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to learn. Now, I'm curious, are there any particular accents or dialects that you find particularly challenging or fascinating?
I'm always intrigued by accents that have a strong musicality or rhythm to them,
Okay.
and I find it fascinating to learn about the historical and cultural factors that have shaped the evolution of different dialects. It's like a linguistic journey through time and space.
I love that analogy. It's like each accent and dialect carries within it a story waiting to be told. And let's transition to a topic that's essential for navigating cross-cultural communication, understanding nonverbal cues.
Yes, nonverbal cues.
They can be just as important as our spoken words in conveying meaning.
They can. The podcast highlights how nonverbal communication can vary widely across cultures and can sometimes lead to misunderstandings.
But true, it's like a hidden language that we're often not even aware of, yet it plays a huge role in our interactions.
Yeah, it does.
What are some key things to keep in mind when trying to understand nonverbal cues in different cultures?
It's important to be observant, to be mindful of your own nonverbal behavior, and to be respectful of cultural differences. Don't assume that a gesture or expression means the same thing in every culture.
Those are all great reminders, like being a cultural anthropologist, studying the subtle nuances of human behavior. Now, I'm curious, are there any particular nonverbal cues that you've found to be particularly interesting or challenging to interpret in different cultures?
I'm always fascinated by the different ways that cultures express greetings and farewells.
Oh, yeah.
A simple handshake in one culture might be replaced by a hug or a bow in another.
Right.
And eye contact, which is often seen as a sign of respect in Western cultures, might be considered rude or aggressive in some Eastern cultures.
Wow.
It's a fascinating area of study.
It really is. It's like a whole other dimension of communication that we're just beginning to understand.
Yeah.
Now, let's shift our focus to something that's not only essential for effective communication, but also for personal growth and enrichment, embracing cultural diversity.
Ah, yes. Cultural diversity. It's one of the greatest gifts of the human experience.
It is. It allows us to see the world through different lenses and to appreciate the beauty of human variation.
It's like a kaleidoscope of perspectives and experiences, each one unique and valuable.
I love that. What are some key things to keep in mind when embracing cultural diversity?
The podcast highlights the importance of approaching other cultures with curiosity, respect, and humility.
Okay.
Be open to learning new things, challenge your own biases, and celebrate the richness of human difference.
Those are all beautiful sentiments. It's like we're all interconnected and each of us has something unique to offer the world. Now, I'm curious, are there
Any particular cultures that you've found to be particularly inspiring or eye-opening?
Such a good question. I'm constantly inspired by cultures that prioritize community connection and respect for the natural world. And I find it fascinating to learn about cultures that have different conceptions of time, space, and reality. It's like it challenges my own assumptions and expands my understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah, absolutely. Now let's talk about something that has undeniably revolutionized the way we communicate.
Okay.
Technology.
Right. It has transformed the communication landscape, hasn't it?
It really has. It's
Yeah.
amazing how we can connect with people all over the world instantly, effortlessly.
It's true. And the podcast highlights how technology has created both opportunities and challenges when it comes to communication.
It has, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right?
Right.
It can connect us, but it can also isolate us.
So what are some of the key things to keep in mind when we're using technology to communicate?
Well, the podcast emphasizes being mindful of our audience, choosing the right platform for our message, and being aware of the potential for miscommunication. But it's also important to remember that technology is a tool. It's supposed to enhance human connection, not replace it.
That's so true, yeah. We have to remember that.
We do.
All right. Are there any particular technologies that you found to be particularly effective or inspiring for facilitating communication?
I'm always really impressed by technologies that enable us to connect with people from different cultures and different backgrounds. So video conferencing, for example,
Yeah.
can bridge geographical distances and allow us to see each other, hear each other. And that fosters a sense of connection. You know, it's more than just words on a screen.
It's like shrinking the world, right?
Right, exactly.
We can have these face-to-face conversations with people who might be thousands of miles away.
Right. And even social media platforms, while they certainly have their downsides, can be used to build community and share information in ways that we never could before.
It's like we're weaving this global web of connection, right?
Right.
We're sharing stories and ideas and experiences across cultures.
Right. But as the podcast emphasizes, we have to use those technologies wisely.
Right.
Be mindful of those pitfalls.
Right, like getting caught up in online echo chambers or
Yeah.
spending more time connecting virtually than we do in person.
Exactly. Exactly. Technology should enhance our lives, not consume them.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of things that enhance our lives,
Yeah.
let's talk about lifelong learning.
Okay.
You mentioned that you wanted to kind of explore language learning a bit deeper, and I think this podcast has some valuable insights into that.
It does. It does. It really emphasizes that language learning is a journey. It's not a destination. There's always something new to learn.
It's like an adventure, right?
It is,
You're
yeah.
exploring new landscapes, meeting new people,
Right.
and just constantly expanding your horizons.
Exactly. And they highlight the importance of being curious and being persistent, but also being patient with yourself.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Embrace the challenges.
Yeah.
Celebrate those little victories along the way.
It was like, enjoy the ride, right?
Exactly.
Savor the process. Don't be too hard on yourself.
Exactly. And just remember that learning a language isn't just about acquiring new words and grammar rules. It's about connecting with other cultures and enriching your life.
Yeah, so true. It's like opening a door to so many possibilities.
It is. It is.
Now, you mentioned in your notes that you've been kind of struggling with active listening,
Mhm.
and the podcast had a whole section about it. And I think it's particularly relevant to you and your goals.
It is. I know it's so important, but I just find myself getting distracted sometimes or jumping in with my own thoughts
Oh, yeah.
before the other person's even finished.
That's a common challenge.
Yeah.
But the podcast highlights some really helpful strategies for becoming a more attentive listener.
Yeah, like what?
Well, they say make eye contact, nod your head,
Hmm.
use verbal cues, like, or I see, to let them know you're paying attention.
Right.
And don't interrupt. Ask clarifying questions
Hey.
and summarize what they've said to make sure you understand.
Right, so you're creating a space for the other person to really feel heard,
Absolutely.
which is so important.
So important for a good connection. All right, let's talk about empathy. You said you wanted to explore that a little more deeply, and the podcast has some really interesting insights on that as well.
Okay, what do they say about empathy?
Well, they define empathy as the ability to understand and share the feelings of another person, to step into their shoes and see the world from their perspective.
It's like putting on a pair of virtual reality goggles
I love that.
that allows you to experience the world through someone else's eyes.
That's such a good analogy.
And they highlight the importance of listening attentively, asking open-ended questions, and really trying to understand the other person's perspective, even if it's different from our own.
It's like we're building these bridges of understanding
Yeah.
and recognizing that, our experiences, while unique, are also universally shared.
Exactly.
Now, you also highlighted a section in the podcast about expressing opinions professionally, which I know is very relevant to your current role at work.
It is. I'm in a lot of meetings where I have to share my ideas, and I want to make sure that I'm doing it in a way that's clear and confident and respectful.
Well, the podcast emphasizes using a variety of phrases.
Okay.
So not just relying on I think all the time.
Right. They suggest mixing it up with things like, from my perspective,
Yeah.
or in my view.
Yes. And disagreeing diplomatically. So you can say things like, I understand where you're coming from, but.
Right. Or, I see your point, but.
So you're acknowledging their perspective, but still asserting your own.
Exactly. And they also talk about how important nonverbal communication is.
Oh, right.
Eye contact, open hand gestures, speaking in a clear and confident tone. All of those things can really project an air of professionalism and credibility.
It's like you're saying, I'm here, I'm engaged, I have something valuable to say, without actually saying it.
Exactly. Yeah, and those nonverbal cues can often be just as important as our words.
So true. Well, we've covered so much today.
We have.
Everything from quirky idioms to all those subtle nuances of professional communication.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing to me how much depth and richness there is to everyday language.
What's really remarkable is how much we can learn about ourselves and other people just by paying attention to how we communicate.
It's like language is a mirror,
It is.
reflecting our thoughts and our feelings and values.
And our cultural perspectives.
And the more we understand about language, the more effectively we can use it to connect with people, to persuade, to inspire.
And to create a world where we can understand each other better.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the power of language and the infinite possibilities that it holds. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep communicating.